And if everything we know about the origin of humanity was only part of the truth? Before time itself unfolded, before the first star ignited the darkness, there was a plan, a grand, incomprehensible design beyond the reach of mortal minds. It existed in a realm outside of what we now call existence, where eternity was not measured in moments but in purpose. And within that purpose, there were beings who beheld its unfolding. One of them was an angel. He had no name, not as humans would understand. Among his kind, names were not necessary, for they knew each other by their very essence. He was a witness, a servant, and above all, a being created to reflect the divine light. He had stood in the presence of the Almighty, a radiance so overwhelming that it was not seen but felt, an energy, a voice that spoke without words, commanding without force, guiding without chains. And then, the voice spoke, and everything began. From nothingness erupted light, splitting the void apart. He watched as the heavens stretched forth, expanding with an immeasurable breath. Planets swirled into existence, and among them, one was chosen. A single world, blue and green, resting in the embrace of a golden sun. But this was only the beginning. The true wonder had not yet been revealed. He saw it before any other, life. Not merely plants or beasts, but something more. A creature sculpted by divine hands, shaped in a reflection of the Creator's own essence. The angel marveled at their form, their innocence, their breath, the first of them, man and woman, standing in a world untouched by time. And yet, in the vastness of eternity, he felt something else. A whisper, an echo of something he could not yet name. A shadow that did not belong to the light. It was distant, but it was there. Watching. Waiting. Before the world even knew its first sunrise, the stage was set. The choice that would alter history had not yet been made, but the forces that would shape it had already begun to move. And the angel wondered, did they truly understand what was to come? The world that was created was not simply a garden. The Garden of Eden was a place of mystery, a realm where life was pure, yet there was an undercurrent of unspoken questions, of things waiting to be discovered. It was a world untouched by the hands of time, a paradise where every leaf, every river, every star, held a secret, an invitation to explore the unknown. Eve, the first woman, wandered through the garden with a sense of awe. Her mind, untarnished by the weight of knowledge, was filled with dreams. Dreams of things yet to be, of a future that was both vast and uncertain. She had not yet tasted the fruit of knowledge, yet there were moments when she felt its pull, a whispering in her heart, a longing to know more. The serpent, ever watchful, saw this longing. It was not simply an animal, nor was it a mere creature of the garden. It was a manifestation of something deeper, something more ancient. It approached Eve, its presence subtle yet undeniable, like a shadow that fell just at the edge of the light. "You do not know what you are missing," the serpent whispered. "You live in the bliss of innocence, but there is so much more. Knowledge. Power. Understanding." Eve hesitated. Her mind raced, torn between the world she knew and the promise of something greater. "But, why? Why should I seek what has not been given?" "Because you are more than what you are," the serpent replied, its voice smooth like silk. "You were made for greatness. The fruit will not harm you, but it will set you free. It will open your eyes to what is beyond this place." The temptation grew within her, as it always does in moments of doubt. She reached out and took the fruit. Her fingers brushed against the smooth surface, and as she brought it closer, she felt her heart race. This was the moment, the choice that would change everything. When Eve took the first bite, the world around her seemed to hold its breath. It was not a loud sound or a grand gesture, but something quieter, something deeper. In that single moment, her mind expanded, her awareness shifted. She understood things that had never been spoken. And in that understanding, a flood of emotions came, fear, wonder, and a deep sense of responsibility. She was no longer innocent. She had crossed a threshold. But it was not just knowledge she gained, it was the awareness of choice. In that moment, she understood the gravity of what had been given to her. The decision was not simply about eating the fruit, it was about the burden of knowing, the weight of understanding what was right and wrong, and the realization that once you know, there is no turning back. Her eyes met Adam's, who had watched silently from a distance. His eyes were full of questions, but before he could ask, Eve handed him the fruit. "Do you see it too?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, and for a long moment, neither spoke. But there, in the quiet of the garden, they both understood that their lives would never be the same. The weight of time pressed heavily upon Adam and Eve as they stood in the aftermath of their choice. The vibrant garden that had once felt like a haven now seemed alien, its beauty distant and cold. The light that had once embraced them now felt harsh, exposing every flaw, every shadow. They were no longer innocent, no longer untouched by the knowledge of good and evil. They were exposed. Fear began to creep in, for the first time. Fear of the unknown. Fear of consequence. And, perhaps most of all, fear of God. When the voice called to them from the depths of the garden, it was not the same voice they had known. It was no longer the voice of a creator who walked with them in the coolness of the day, it was a voice that carried weight, a voice that demanded an answer. They had heard it in their hearts, even before it was spoken aloud. They had known this moment would come, and yet, they had not been prepared for it. "Where are you?" The voice echoed through the trees. They could not hide. They tried, but the garden that had once been their home was now a place of exile. The shame they felt was not just about their actions, it was about the realization that they were no longer who they had been. They were changed, and they could never return to what they had known. God approached them, his presence undeniable. His words were not full of anger, but there was a sorrow in his voice that cut deeper than any punishment. "What have you done?" he asked, his gaze piercing through them. Adam's voice cracked as he spoke, blaming Eve for the fruit, and Eve in turn pointed to the serpent. In that moment, the blame was passed from one to another, but it was clear to all that no one could escape the responsibility of choice. And so, the punishment was given, not out of vengeance, but as a consequence of their own decisions. The earth, once perfect, would now be cursed. The labor of life would become a burden. Pain, sorrow, and death would enter the world. And the first humans were cast out of the garden, the place they had once called home, into a world that was foreign and unforgiving. But the story did not end there. As Adam and Eve left the gates of Eden, the true weight of their choices became clear. The world beyond was harsh, its beauty tempered by the consequences of their actions. And yet, even in the exile, a new awareness was born within them, a sense that they were not alone. They had each other. And they had a future to build, no matter how uncertain. As they wandered into the unknown, the echo of their decision reverberated through time. The world outside of Eden was a place of harsh realities and heavy burdens. Adam and Eve had begun to understand what it meant to live with the consequences of their choices. The earth, once pure and bountiful, was now a place of toil and suffering. But the most painful part of their exile was the gradual shift within humanity, a darkness that began to spread, like a sickness infecting the hearts of their children and their children's children. As generations passed, the earth grew increasingly corrupt. The hearts of men turned cold, and violence began to reign. The beauty of creation was marred by greed, hatred, and disregard for life. It seemed that the world was on the brink of collapse, and yet, amidst the chaos, there was still a flicker of hope, a man named Noah. Noah was different. He had not abandoned the ways of righteousness, though he stood alone in a world that had long since lost its way. His heart was pure, and he walked with God, as his forefathers had done before him. And because of this, God spoke to him, delivering a warning, a message of impending judgment. "The earth is filled with violence," God said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I will bring a flood to cleanse it. But you, Noah, will build an ark. You and your family will be saved." Noah's mind raced. The flood. He had heard of such things in stories, but never had he imagined that such a calamity would come in his time. He was instructed to gather animals, to prepare the ark, and to warn the people of the coming storm. But no one listened. They mocked him, laughed at him. The idea of a great flood seemed impossible to them. The world, they thought, was too stable, too predictable. But Noah continued, building the ark, gathering the creatures, preparing for the unknown. Days passed, and the sky began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a change in the wind, a deepening of the clouds. But as time went on, the signs became undeniable. Strange weather patterns formed, storms that had never been seen before. And still, the people refused to believe. The moment came. Noah, his family, and the animals entered the ark, and the doors were sealed. Then, the sky opened up. The floodwaters began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and force. The ground trembled, and the earth seemed to weep, as though it had long ago known the price of human sin. The ark rocked with the fury of the storm, the sounds of the world outside drowned by the crashing waves. Inside, there was a tense silence. Noah could hear the cries of the people who had once mocked him, their voices now desperate, filled with regret. But it was too late. The floodwaters rose higher, swallowing the world, erasing all that had been. And Noah, though safe within the ark, felt the weight of the loss. He had been given a chance to save the future, but at what cost? The world outside, once teeming with life, was now a vast, empty ocean. As the storm raged on, Noah and his family waited, knowing that when the waters receded, nothing would be the same. The world Noah had once known was forever changed. As the floodwaters receded and the ark came to rest on the mountaintop, the earth began to heal. Life returned, slowly but steadily, and the remnants of humanity were given a second chance. Among those survivors was a man named Abraham, a man whose faith would be tested in ways few could ever comprehend. Abraham was a man of great faith, but also a man of deep questions. He had been promised a future, a promise of descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, a lineage that would carry the hope of humanity. Yet, as the years passed, Abraham found himself growing old, and the promise seemed more distant with each passing day. His wife, Sarah, was barren, and despite their prayers, the child they had longed for had not arrived. One day, when Abraham was deep in thought, God spoke to him once again. "Abraham," the voice called, "take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you will offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will show you." The word struck Abraham like a blow. The son he had waited for all his life, the child through whom the promise would be fulfilled, was to be sacrificed. It was a command that made no sense. How could he reconcile the love he felt for Isaac with the demand he had just received? The confusion was overwhelming, but in that moment, Abraham did not question. He did not protest. Instead, he set out at once, trusting that somehow, the purpose would be revealed. The journey was long and heavy with silence. Isaac, unaware of the fate that awaited him, walked beside his father, asking innocent questions. "Father, where is the lamb for the offering?" he asked as they approached the place of sacrifice. Abraham's heart broke as he responded, his voice trembling. "God will provide the lamb, my son." When they arrived at the designated mountain, Abraham built the altar, placing the wood carefully upon it. Isaac stood silently, a quiet understanding passing between them. It was in the stillness of that moment that Abraham's heart wrestled with the impossible. Could he really go through with it? Could he truly sacrifice the son he loved more than anything? He bound Isaac and placed him on the altar. Just as he raised the knife, ready to obey, a voice called out to him from the heavens. "Abraham! Abraham!" He stopped, the knife trembling in his hand, and looked up. "Here I am," he answered, his voice a whisper. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," God commanded. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." At that moment, Abraham's heart was flooded with relief and joy. He turned, and there, caught in a thicket, was a ram, God's provision, a substitute for Isaac. Abraham sacrificed the ram, and in that act, the bond between father and son, and between man and God, was sealed forever. The promise of descendants as numerous as the stars remained intact, but Abraham's faith had been proven. And through this trial, both he and Isaac would never be the same. Jacob's life had always been one of struggle. From the moment he was born, his hands grasped at the world, literally, as he had taken hold of his twin brother Esau's heel, a sign of his deep desire to be first, to take what he felt was rightfully his. His entire life was defined by conflict, by manipulation, and by striving for what he wanted, even when it meant deceiving those closest to him. He had taken his brother's birthright and, with the help of his mother, had deceived their father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing meant for Esau. This act of trickery had cost him dearly, as Esau's anger boiled over, and Jacob had been forced to flee for his life, leaving behind his home, his family, and everything he had known. He journeyed to Haran, seeking refuge with his uncle Laban. In Haran, Jacob's life was marked by a new kind of struggle. He worked hard for Laban, enduring years of deceit and hardship. Yet, despite his trials, Jacob prospered, and through it all, he never stopped striving. He worked for Laban's daughters, Rachel and Leah, but it was Rachel whom he loved most deeply. In his pursuit of her, Jacob was deceived in the same way he had deceived his own father. He was tricked into marrying Leah before Rachel. But even in this, he did not give up. He worked another 7 years to marry Rachel, and the bitterness of his past actions seemed to follow him, like a shadow. As the years passed, Jacob began to accumulate wealth and build a family of his own. But he knew his past had left a stain that could not be washed away. The time came when God called him to return to the land of his father, Isaac. But Jacob feared facing Esau again, fearing that his brother's anger would still burn hot against him. One night, as Jacob prepared to meet Esau, he was alone by the river Jabbok, reflecting on his life and the choices he had made. It was there, in the solitude of that moment, that a mysterious figure appeared. The figure was not human, but something more, something otherworldly. The two of them began to wrestle, their struggle lasting through the night, neither one willing to give in. Jacob fought with everything in him. He fought with his guilt, his fear, his desire for redemption. And as the dawn began to break, the mysterious figure touched Jacob's hip, dislocating it with a single movement. Yet Jacob did not let go. Despite the pain, despite the impossible odds, he held on. "I will not let you go until you bless me," Jacob demanded, his voice strained but resolute. The figure, now revealing itself as a divine being, looked at him with a mixture of pity and admiration. "What is your name?" it asked. "Jacob," he replied. "No longer shall your name be Jacob," the figure said. "From now on, you will be called Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." In that moment, Jacob was forever changed. He had been given a new name, a new identity, and a new destiny. He had wrestled with his past, with his guilt, with his very soul, and through that struggle, he had found transformation. His fear of Esau faded, and when he finally met his brother, it was with forgiveness, not animosity. They embraced, and the past was left behind. From that day forward, Jacob, now Israel, would be the father of 12 sons, whose descendants would become the 12 tribes of Israel. His life was marked not only by the struggles he faced but by the faith that emerged from those struggles. And in the end, his story was not one of deceit or failure, but one of redemption, transformation, and a new beginning. Joseph's life had been shaped by the hands of his brothers, who, driven by jealousy and hatred, had thrown him into a pit, abandoned him, and sold him into slavery. His dreams of greatness, once vivid and promising, had seemed shattered by the betrayal of his own flesh and blood. But Joseph's story was far from over. In Egypt, Joseph's journey took him through a series of trials, each one seemingly darker than the last. He became a servant in the household of Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh. But even in this foreign land, where everything seemed against him, Joseph remained steadfast. His integrity, his faith, and his ability to rise above the circumstances caught the attention of Potiphar. However, the shadow of his past caught up with him again when Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of assault, a crime he did not commit. This led to Joseph being thrown into prison. But even in the deepest of prisons, Joseph's light shone through. He gained the trust of the prison warden, and his ability to interpret dreams became known. One day, two of Pharaoh's servants, his cupbearer and his baker, were thrown into prison with Joseph. Both had troubling dreams, and Joseph, with God's help, interpreted their meanings. For the cupbearer, the dream foretold his restoration to his position, while for the baker, it foretold his death. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him once he was restored to Pharaoh's service, hoping to be freed from prison. But time passed, and the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. Still, Joseph waited, trusting that his time would come. Then, 2 years later, Pharaoh himself had troubling dreams. No one in his court could interpret them, and at last, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. He was summoned, and with God's wisdom, Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. The dreams foretold of 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh, amazed by Joseph's wisdom, appointed him as the second in command of all Egypt, placing him in charge of preparing the nation for the coming famine. Joseph's rise to power was swift and dramatic. From the pit to the palace, his life had come full circle. His brothers, unaware of his transformation, came to Egypt during the famine, seeking food. They did not recognize the man who stood before them, but Joseph recognized them immediately. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Joseph stood at the crossroads of justice and mercy. He could have avenged the wrongs done to him, but instead, he chose a path of forgiveness. He tested his brothers, pushing them to confront their past actions, and only when they proved themselves changed did he reveal his identity. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Fear gripped his brothers. They feared his wrath, for they had wronged him deeply. But Joseph reassured them with a grace that stunned them. "Do not be afraid," he said. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph forgave his brothers and invited them to live in Egypt, where he provided for them during the remainder of the famine. His story, once one of betrayal and hardship, became one of reconciliation and restoration. In the end, Joseph understood that his journey, with all its twists and turns, had been part of a larger plan. A plan that went beyond his own suffering and triumph, to the salvation of a nation, and to the preservation of God's promise to his family. As we look back on these stories, of creation, exile, sacrifice, struggle, and redemption, one thing becomes clear: humanity's journey is a tapestry of divine intervention, human frailty, and transformation. From the first act of creation to the rise of kings and the fall of men, these ancient stories reveal more than just the origins of people. They show us that the heart of humanity's story is one of seeking meaning, understanding, and connection with something greater than ourselves. The journey of Adam and Eve, marked by the choices of a garden, led to the pain of exile but also to the realization of free will. Noah's obedience in the face of overwhelming despair gave the world a second chance, a reminder that even in darkness, there is light. Abraham's faith in the face of impossible sacrifice painted the portrait of a man who trusted in God's promises, no matter how daunting they appeared. Jacob's wrestling with his own identity and destiny was a pivotal moment, showing that even in struggle, there is a path to transformation. And Joseph, the dreamer betrayed by his own brothers, rose from the pit to the throne, teaching us that betrayal and hardship can be the stepping stones to something greater than we ever imagined. Each of these stories speaks to the eternal struggle between destiny and free will, between suffering and redemption. It's a reminder that no matter where we are on our journey, whether in the garden, the flood, or in the midst of our deepest trials, we are never truly alone. There is always a purpose, even in our darkest moments. And while the paths of these ancient figures were fraught with challenges, they also reveal that there is always a way forward, always a chance for growth, forgiveness, and renewal. Humanity's story, in all its complexities, invites us to reflect on our own lives. Just as Adam and Eve chose, just as Noah obeyed, just as Abraham trusted, just as Jacob wrestled, and just as Joseph forgave, we too face moments of choice, moments that define who we are and what we believe. These stories remind us that the beginning of humanity was not a simple tale of creation but one of profound purpose and possibility. And as we look ahead, we are called to consider, what is our place in this grand narrative? What decisions will we make, and how will we shape the world for those who come after us? As the stories of old echo through the ages, they continue to inspire, to challenge, and to call us forward, reminding us that every end marks the beginning of something new. Thank you for following this journey through the beginning and destiny of humanity. Let us reflect on these ancient lessons, as they continue to guide us today. Share your thoughts with us, and let's keep the conversation going. From the dust we were formed, and to the dust we shall return, but in between, we are given the chance to choose our path.